Hello everyone, bringing you a video today which forms the second part of my beginner's guide to the 1944 pattern web equipment. And what we're going to be looking at today is several different mannequins showing different methods of wearing 1944 pattern, how it was adopted for different roles and so forth, generally in a jungle warfare scenario, various jungle warfare scenarios. This will form a bit of a timeline as well. I will be doing more videos looking at the various components in more detail, as I have done, say, the 1937 pattern frog, the 1937 pattern basic pouch, the 1958 pattern ammunition pouch. The videos I've done on those in more detail I will be doing for the various components of 1944 pattern, where applicable, where the items differ and where there is interest in looking at the components in more detail. But this is another part of the beginners series, so I thought it would be worth looking at the different methods of wear for 1944 pattern. That said, the first mannequin we have here is wearing the equipment pretty much as prescribed. It represents a member of 5th Parachute Brigade on deployment to Java in late 1945, specifically Batavia, the city of Batavia, which corresponds to modern-day Jakarta. We'll go through what's on the mannequin here. Starting at the top, of course, we have the airborne beret worn with the Parachute Regiment cap badge, and the shirt worn is part of the late war jungle equipment, which was intended for use in the continuing war in the Far East, which of course never transpired. So this basically represents what the British infantrymen would have looked like in the Far East had the war continued. The equipment itself is worn pretty much as per the fitting instructions. So we have the basic pouches around the front here, supported by the braces, worn very much as the fitting instructions instruct that they should be, obviously high on the belt because this is all first issue components. And we'll have a look at the back of the equipment now as well. So here you can see the back of the web equipment, and we can see the braces here supporting the belt. There's no haversack worn because patrolling through the streets, it wasn't really necessary to carry the haversack, so basically wearing musketry order with the addition of the water bottle. And the water bottle, of course, is carried in its carrier, which, as you can see here, is suspended from the belt using the M1910 style hanger hooks there on the right hip. So that's a look at this very early use of the equipment, late 1945 with 5th Parachute Brigade out in Java. The equipment will, of course, go on to be used in Korea and Malaya. In Korea and throughout Malaya, it was often worn like this with the haversack on the back as well, so very much as the fitting instructions show, and as I showed in the previous video, generally minus the chest strap supporting the pouches. That didn't tend to be bothered with. But it was also adapted in certain ways as well. Certainly later on, from midway through the Malayan emergency onwards, you see a lot of adaptation of the equipment for different purposes. And we're going to have a look at that now. We're going to move on to look at a mannequin representing British infantry in Malaya. Here we have the mannequin set up for Malaya, and specifically Malaya 1953, and I say that because this is based directly off footage taken in 1953 by Pathé News, which is available on YouTube. I think it's called Malayan Patrol, and it will put a link to that in the corner of the video there in a card. So this is based directly off that footage, and it's men out on a one-day patrol, so the kit carried is very light. There's no haversack or anything, just the belt kit basically. So we'll talk a little bit about the uniform on the mannequin first, and then we'll run through the equipment carried. At the top here we have the cotton jungle hat, and at the neck we have a sweat rag, as you can see. And the uniform itself is the 1950 pattern jungle green Airtex bush jacket, fairly newly introduced at this time period, obviously 1950 pattern, but certainly showing up in photographs by this period. And this is quite a faded example from the collections, had the belt removed and so forth, which was not uncommon to do because it wasn't the most practical thing to have on the jacket in the field. The equipment itself is a very stripped down set of 1944 pattern web equipment. We'll talk about the web equipment first before we talk about the ammunition carriage here. The waist, of course, we have the belt, and this is worn without any form of support, as you can see, just sitting on the hips. On the right hand hip here we have one basic pouch. Obviously this has been modified. If you've watched the previous part of the beginner's guide, the pouch has been modified by having 2 slits cut in the back, which allows it to be worn low on the belt. This was a modification that was introduced before the second issue pouches began to be issued, which was in the mid to late 60s, well, probably the late 60s, introduced possibly in the mid 60s, so very much after this time period. But kit was often modified, and this is one example of that, the pouch being modified to sit low on the belt. And we'll turn the mannequin round now and have a look at the back, and you'll be able to see the water bottle is also carried round on the left hip. Here we have the back of the mannequin, and you can see the first issue water bottle carried round on the left hip. The second issue water bottle, of course, would not appear until the late 1950s, So still have the first issue here. In contrast to the previous mannequin, it's being worn up on the belt rather than using the hanger hook, so using the integral belt loop in the back of the back of the carrier there, worn around on the left hip. As you can see, the belt sits somewhat lower on the hips because obviously there's nothing supporting it. And we'll talk about the bandolier a little bit more in just a moment, but you can see here the strap for that at the back is simply secured in place by being knotted so that it sits on the hips. Moving back to the front of the mannequin, you can see here ammunition carried in a bandolier around the waist, and as you've seen at the back, this is simply knotted around the waist to sit on the hips. Quite a convenient way of carrying ammunition, and you have 50 rounds of 303 here. This obviously being for a man armed with the number 5 jungle carbine, the number 5 rifle, obviously became synonymous with jungle warfare after the Second World War. So ammunition carriage would depend on the weapon carried. It's not clear whether the basic pouches in the video are being used to carry ammunition or whether they're actually, in fact, being used to carry the brew making kits that the men have, the Tommy cookers, tin tea and tin milk. It certainly would fit conveniently in a basic pouch, and given there doesn't seem to be any other way of carrying the tea making kit they have with them, it seems to make sense that it would be carried in the basic pouch with ammunition carriage like this for those armed with 303 rifles. Those armed with M1 carbines seem to have locally made pouches, which is another expedient and a way that the 1944 pattern was modified and augmented depending on the weapon carried and the duties being conducted. So I thought this would be an interesting thing to look at of how fairly early in its post-war service life, 1944 pattern was modified and adjusted for different roles. We'll move on now to look at the Borneo confrontation in the 1960s. Okay, so we're moving on to look at the Indonesia-Borneo confrontation now, of course the 1960s. Having looked at the 40s and 50s, we're now going to look at the 1960s. And this mannequin here is specifically referenced off some footage shot by the BBC, a short documentary called Jungle Green, which again I will put a card up in the corner of the video to that because it's available on YouTube. Very much worth a watch if you're interested in the confrontation. And as I say, the kit, as I recommended to do previously, the kit here is basically referenced directly from men seen in the footage and what they were carrying. Now looking at the front here, you may think there's not a huge amount of 1944 pattern to look at, so we'll go over what the mannequin's wearing. Again, we have the jungle hat at the top there, again the sweat rag at the neck, and you have here the 1950 pattern bush jacket again, the Airtex bush jacket. Other patterns were in use at the time, but this was still very prevalent as well. So the basic equipment here, you can see at the front are 2 ammunition pouches and a belt, which are part of the 1958, the early 1958 pattern. You actually have a first issue and a second issue ammunition pouch here, and obviously the 1958 pattern belt. The rest of the equipment is actually 1944 pattern, and when we turn the mannequin around, you'll be able to see that a bit more clearly, but you can actually see the L straps from the 1944 pattern haversack here. There's one other piece of 58 pattern which is attached to the haversack, which we'll have a look at in just a second. So here we have the back of the mannequin, and as you can see here, the haversack from the 1944 pattern equipment is being worn. The troops represented in Jungle Green, the troops shown are from 40 Commando, and they're on 3-day patrol. So rather than a very short patrol, we saw obviously the mannequin representing troops in Malaya, very short patrol. This is representing someone on 3-day patrol, so you've got the added carrying capacity of the haversack, in which you would carry your rations, dry clothing, and obviously sleeping gear. So we have the poncho rolled up underneath as an example of that, and you have a pair of high-top boots here, high-top canvas and rubber boots, basically locally made copy of Converse boots for wear at night when there's some attempt being made to dry the jungle boots out. There's one additional piece of 1958 pattern equipment here, which is attached to the 44 pattern haversack, which is the 1958 pattern, the early first issue 1958 pattern water bottle pouch, which is at the top of the C-clips hooked through the eyelets on the front of the haversack flap there, as you can see, and there's certainly at least one member of 40 Commando in the footage who's done this, which is a very practical way of carrying an extra bit of water there. There are also 2 1944 pattern water bottles, which we'll have a look at in just a minute. Points of interest with the haversack, obviously it's being worn with the L straps over the shoulders, but there's no support from any braces or anything, so it's literally just hanging on the shoulders on the L straps. Very common at the time, although you do see some troops, particularly the Gurkhas, still wearing full sets of 1944 pattern equipment as well. The airborne units and the Gurkhas had something of a unit issue of 1944 pattern, as well as it being theatre issue. So they often see them wearing full sets of it, or certainly still wearing the braces and the pouches in the regulation manner, according to the fitting instructions. But this is worn obviously with no supporting element at all, 58 belt, and you can't attach the 1944 pattern braces to that. So the haversack is just hung on the shoulders. In terms of carrying the poncho here on the bottom, there's an interesting thing here, which is a detail I've seen in Korea and elsewhere, Malaya and Borneo, not uncommon to do, is using the waist strap, or the chest strap rather, from the haversack, which if you've watched the previous version, the previous part of this series, there's a strap on the haversack which is supposed to come around loop and help keep the ammunition pouches up against the chest. There are little loops in the back of the ammunition pouches for that purpose in the basic pouches. This strap is sometimes used to help steady the load underneath the haversack instead. So rather than being looped around the chest, the strap's been brought down round underneath the poncho, and as you can see, it's been buckled around the poncho there, which gives a bit more lateral stability and stops it sliding around as much underneath, and just gives a bit of extra support, takes some of the weight off these carrying straps here, these straps underneath for carrying the poncho. So that's a look at the back. We'll have a look at each side now, just have a quick look at the water bottles in their carriers. So here on the left hip we have a 1944 pattern water bottle in its carrier, and this is the first issue with the metal cap. Although the rubber cap had been introduced by this point, there were still plenty of these in use, as is shown in the footage. So that's on the left hip here. And on the right hip we have another 1944 pattern water bottle in its carrier, and you can see here both of them in fact are carried on the belt. Obviously the eyelets on the 1958 pattern belt aren't really properly situated to use the hanger hooks. This one's had them removed anyway, so this carrier rather has had them removed anyway, so it's hung on the belt using the belt loop. And this is the second issue water bottle, obviously with the rubber cap, which were obviously in use by this time, having been introduced into service in the late 50s. Also, you can see the load on the back here a little bit more clearly now. We've got the 1958 pattern water bottle carrier hanging off the haversack there, and you can see the ankle boots, the canvas and rubber ankle boots underneath the flap of the haversack there, on top of the spare clothing and rations and so forth carried in there. So that's a look at this mannequin, obviously representing a Marine of 40 Commando, circa 1964, based directly off the footage in jungle green. We're going to move on now to look at the 1970s. Moving on to the last mannequin we're going to be looking at today, and that's this, set up for the 1970s, so a jump forward to the 1970s, 1978 specifically, in Belize, British Army on deployment in Belize, referenced directly off a photograph or series of photographs on Getty Images, so copyrighted, I can't put them in the video, but I will put a pinned comment below the video, linking through to the references I've used for all the mannequins in the video if you're interested to see. And this is the first time we see some second issue components other than the water bottle, which obviously came in a bit before the second issue web equipment. We see some second issue web equipment components on this mannequin. But before we get to the web equipment, very briefly talk about the uniform. This, I swear, is an original DPM Tropical Combat shirt. It's not one of the Dragon replicas. It really is this bright in reality. Polycotton Tropical Combat shirt in this very bright Dayglow DPM, as it's colloquially termed for obvious reasons. And then we have a jungle hat made in the same material, although obviously much more subdued colours on the hat there, and obviously sweat rag at the neck again. So by the late 70s, this uniform has come into use, although you'd still see some of the green uniform in use. There was an overlap, obviously, as uniform wore out, and this was brought in to replace the preceding green Airtex cotton bush jackets and so forth. So, 70s uniform. The web equipment in this case is all 1944 pattern, as we will see. And here at the front we can see a series of second issue components. We have the second issue web belt, which is made of the heavier duty webbing, and details of that are in the first part of this series, and two second issue ammunition pouches left and right. And these obviously hang lower on the belt, and there's nothing supporting them here. The braces aren't being worn. You just have the ammunition pouches hanging on the upper set of C-hooks, which means they hang lower on the belt. So they're on the belt there. We'll have a look at the back of the mannequin now and see the rest of the equipment. Around the back of the mannequin here we can see the 1944 pattern haversack, and this is again a first issue. The photographs I've seen, they seem to be wearing first issue. You can't see the great bulk of the second issue, although there aren't any photographs from the back that I've been able to see, so this is inference. But the first issue haversack with less slung on the outside, presumably on a shorter patrol in the photographs I've seen. But first issue haversack there, again just hung on the L-straps on the shoulders, not hooked into any braces or anything because no braces are being worn. And then we have two water bottle carriers down on the belt there, both containing the black cap, the rubber cap second issue water bottle, by this point more common to see. So yes, that's the basic setup here. So as I say, that's the last mannequin we're going to have a look at now. I thought it would be useful to do a run through of 1944 pattern, show various ways it was worn in the field. Obviously it was worn as prescribed in the fitting instructions quite commonly, but this is just a run through of various different methods of wearing it, and obviously now looking at the second issue components issued in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, and then used through the 70s and 80s. The water bottle would also turn up very commonly in the water bottle carrier elsewhere. I think the last time I've seen one in use was on a set of 58 pattern in the Gulf, but they may well have gone on further into the 1990s. And I think the belts, there's a good anecdote from a friend of mine who's in the lifeguards, who saw a chap, parachute, I think it was parachute regiment, wearing one of these with his MTP uniform very recently in the last few years. And it was subsequently removed when it was commented on. So that's a real, if he was caught in photograph, that's a real head scratcher for future reenactors. Why is this chap wearing a 1944 pattern belt? Not the norm, I hasten to add. So a very long service life for certain components, particularly the water bottle carrier and the water bottle. As I say, you see those turn up a lot, particularly parachute regiment. You often see them added to their 58 pattern when they transferred over to 58 pattern. So very interesting equipment from that point of view, and I just thought it would be interesting to do a run through today of different time periods it was worn and different methods for wearing it. If you're looking to recreate British troops in the Malayan emergency, Borneo in the 70s, make sure you try and find reference of exactly what you want to do. At this time, in this time frame, 1958 pattern was also seen used in tropical environments, and it was in the 60s as well. So there was a mishmash, as we saw on the Borneo mannequin. So my advice is always, and I repeat this in every video I do advising reenactors, is try and find primary sources, try and find photographs or footage of the troops you want to recreate and try and copy it exactly as you can. So there it is. I hope you found that interesting, as I always say. If you like this sort of content, if you like these uploads, then please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And also, if you are subscribing, make sure you hit the notification button, the little bell there, which will alert you when I upload future videos. Of course, I have a Facebook and Instagram page where I've put sneak peeks up of these videos, and I also put photographs up of the collection as well, so there may be some photographs of this mannequin up on there and things as well, and others as well, reenacting events and so forth. So, good place to check out. Facebook's a good place to get in touch with me as well if you wish to. But that's everything I wanted to say in this video, so until the next part of this series or until the next video, bye for now.